Great. So we've just been talking about this concept of interest-based problem solving and positions and interests and being able to distinguish between what people say they want and what they really need. So what we want to do now is spend some time talking about how you as a manager can actually uncover people's interests. Because the reality is often these interests are not explicitly stated, and people themselves are not completely always aware of what their interests are and what's motivating them to take a particular position. So we want to spend some time talking about a technique called inquiry, which is one of the techniques you can use to help uncover what people's interests are. And this process of using inquiry to uncover interests is what you should be using before you begin the process of concretely brainstorming ways to resolve people's problems. So it is an element that you will need to use as you help people problem solve. But it's an aspect that often gets overlooked by managers. When we are in the midst of a busy day and someone comes to us to get a problem solved, we tend to skip over this step of using inquiry to uncover people's interests and what their needs are, and instead we jump right to problem solving about that 10% of that tip of the iceberg. So we spend all this time and all this energy problem solving without really understanding the problem we should be solving. So this module is all about spending the time to uncover what the interests are with the goal of understanding the problem so we can move on and help people feel satisfied and good about the resolution they've come up with. Okay? So what we will do in this module is we will start with a very basic concept of talking about inquiry and open-ended and close-ended questions. And then we will make the module increasingly complex. Things will get a little bit more difficult as we go. So hang in there if you're feeling initially that this is a bit basic, because the module will build. When we talk about inquiry, this is just a basic definition. The process of strategically asking questions to help people explore their interests, enhance communication, build trust, and resolve problems. Okay? That's what we're talking about. Really asking questions. And there are two types of questions that we can use when we solve problems: open-ended and close-ended questions. So let me ask you, what is an open-ended question? How would you define that? Excellent. So open-ended questions, right? As you've said, oh shit. Sorry, reverse that. You'll start with close-ended questions. So what is a close-ended question? Excellent. So as people have said, a close-ended question is an answer. It can be answered with in one of two ways: yes or no. It's sometimes called a dichotomous question. Okay? But the idea here is that close-ended questions really limit the amount of information that you get back. So when you say to somebody, are you angry? Or are you excited? The answer is yes or no. You're not spending time really opening up the conversation and allowing somebody to talk. So close-ended questions limit the scope of the conversation. They are often used for fact-finding. So we see this a lot when people in their own minds, managers, have sort of an idea of what should happen. And somebody comes to them and they say, I have this problem. And they'll say, well, have you tried doing this? Have you tried doing this? These are all examples of close-ended questions. And in those examples, what you'll notice is there's often an answer embedded in that. So we call those leading questions. So if I have an employee who comes to me and they say, I'm really having trouble managing all of the things that I'm doing. Okay, I have a lot of competing priorities and I'm really having trouble managing that. If I use close-ended questions to explore what they're saying, I might say something like, well, have you tried setting aside time every day to respond to your emails and other times of the day where you don't respond to email? That's one example of a close-ended question that's also leading. It has solutions embedded in it. And typically the response that it gets when I ask questions like that from a staff member might be something like, yes, of course I tried that. Or, oh, no, I guess not. I guess I could try that. And what that does is it does a couple of things. It sometimes frustrates people because it implies that they weren't smart enough or savvy enough to come up with these options on their own. And if they have done that, that can sometimes create some tension between you and your staff person. And other times it has the effect of shaming people. So God, I guess I should have thought of that. Now I feel really, really stupid for not having come up with that myself. So it can be more helpful to help people think through the process and ask open-ended questions. So when we talk about open-ended questions, right, as you all know, these are questions that start with any number of these kinds of things. Who, how, when, how many, right? All of these are ways to start an open-ended question. And the idea with an open-ended question is that these are questions that have an infinite number of answers. And so we want to, again, open up the number of possible answers that we could get from somebody, and we do that by asking open-ended questions. You'll notice that on this very last one here, tell me more. Now, technically, tell me more is not a way to start a question, but for our purposes, it will be. So it's one of my favorite ways to engage with a staff member. When they tell me something, or they talk about a problem, or they're expressing a concern, I'll say, tell me more about that. Just tell me more, right? It's a great, easy way to elicit more information without having to think too hard about how you frame it, okay? So our goal as we talk about inquiry is to focus on using open-ended questions. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask you to use your participant guides. You have a worksheet that looks like this, and take the next few minutes to work with the person next to you and turn each of these 3 close-ended questions into a broad, open-ended question. Okay, so take 5 minutes and then we'll check in to see how you did. Now that we've talked about using close-ended questions versus open-ended questions and really distinguishing between the two, we're going to start to get a little bit more complex and look at the ways in which you listen for certain aspects of information that come out to ensure that you're helping people identify what is most important to them and really identify where the interests are in a conversation. Okay? And in order to do that, we're going to talk about 2 issues. Well, scratch that. It's not really issues. We're going to talk about 2 concepts. We're going to talk about a concept called relevance and irrelevance. Okay, that's going to be represented by our target. And we're going to talk about a concept called funneling, which we'll get to in a moment. When you use relevance and irrelevance, what you're doing is you're listening in a conversation to hear what seems to be relevant to somebody as they're explaining or expressing concerns about a problem. And how might you know if something is relevant? So for example, if you have a staff member who comes to you and they say, you know, can you help me solve this problem with my time management, right? You're gonna ask a bunch of questions, hopefully. You know, you might say, tell me more about where you're struggling to manage your time. And as they respond, you wanna be listening for aspects of their response that seem to be most relevant to them, okay? How would you know if something is relevant to somebody? What might they do or say, or how might they say it in ways that would indicate relevance? So here are the kinds of responses you might get from participants are things like people might talk a lot if you ask a question, or their facial expressions might change. They might get very animated, or they might withdraw from the conversation. They might become confused or frustrated, but there's some sort of either nonverbal or verbal indication that what you've asked about is really relevant for them, okay? And we'll talk about where you plot relevance on the target. Then as a trainer, you're gonna ask them, how would you know if you've asked a question that isn't relevant to the issue they have, right? And that's the question you're framing. How would you know if you've asked a question about something that is relevant to the issue they have or irrelevant to the issue that they have, okay? So once you have that conversation with participants and you're just having a very general surface level conversation about the things you'd be looking for to indicate relevance or irrelevance, then you're going to demonstrate this using a personal example. So what I'll do in this demo is I'll model for you an example that I use in trainings, and then you should spend some time thinking about a relevant example from your own management experience that you could use to illustrate these concepts of relevance and irrelevance. and later funneling, okay? So what I'd like to do at this point is share with you an example of relevance and irrelevance and how this technique was used with me in a management context so that you can see how a manager could use inquiry and be listening for what's relevant or irrelevant to try to uncover interests. So in the example that I'm going to share, this is an example slightly modified from reality, so not totally real, but this is an example from a job I was in many, many years ago where I was in a management capacity and one of the members of my management team left to go out on maternity leave. And I assumed responsibility for her team. So what I'll tell you about is sort of what happened in that situation and how my manager at the time used this process to understand the problem that I was in at that point. So what happened in this situation is that, as I said, a member of the management team went out on maternity leave and I assumed responsibility for managing her team. And this was quite a long maternity leave in the US context. And so she went out for about 6 months. And the idea was that during this time, I would manage her team in addition to the team I was managing, but that this would be not a huge amount of time invested on my part. The idea was this was, sort of a high functioning team and I would take over responsibility for that team and just manage that for the 6 months that she was away. And when she returned, she would take back over responsibility for her team. So those were some of the expectations when I took this on. What happened in reality is that over time, I realized that this team was not the high-performing team that I had been told it was. There were a number of different issues, and the person never actually ended up coming back from their maternity leave. So I ended up managing the team for over a year, in addition to the team that I was managing. And there were a number of challenges in that experience. And so what happened over time is I became increasingly frustrated and increasingly resentful. And eventually, I had a conversation with my manager, and in that case, she really used this technique to identify and uncover what were really the problems here and what was motivating me to take some of the positions that I was. And essentially, the position that I was framing was, you have to do something about this and change the situation or I'm going to leave. Right? That was my ultimatum that I had kind of delivered. And now she, as my manager, was in the position of trying to understand where this was coming from. Okay? So that's the setup. As trainers, be sure to set up your example before you illustrate it. So what I'm going to share with you is just a sampling of the types of questions she asked me as she was helping to uncover what my interests were and why I was taking this very firm demand that she needed to solve this problem and get me relief or I was leaving. So one of the very first questions that she asked, how are you feeling? And I responded by having a very emotional reaction, which is one of the things that indicates that this would have been hitting the target, a very relevant question for her to be asking. So I responded by saying, I'm not good, I'm totally burned out, I'm feeling, angry and resentful and concerned that I'm gonna have to leave my job and, just completely overwhelmed, right? That was my response. And so then she responds by saying, well, how's your team doing, right? How's your team doing? And I respond by saying, my team is fine, right? I give a very, very curt response. There's not a lot of information. And what this should indicate to her, and it does, is that this is not really relevant to the position that I've taken, the issue at hand, okay? So I respond by saying, my team is fine, that's not where the issue is. So she asks another question. She says, well, tell me what you're working on. And I have a response to this, which is, you should kind of know what I'm working on, but, I'm working on a million different things. I'm working on training and building programs and supervising people, and I'm working on all these different things. But that really isn't where a lot of my energy and emphasis is being put in my response. So it's just, I kind of list for her all of the various things that I'm working on, and that's my response. So it indicates to her this is not a hugely relevant question for this conversation. Then she asks me, well, how are your trainings going? And I give her a one-word response. Fine. Everything is great. No problem. Right? Very, very curt. Again, not really relevant to this conversation. But as a manager, she's just trying to understand what's important here and make sure she understands it. So that's why she's asking all these questions. And then she asks this question, really important question. She says, what were your expectations when you took on responsibility for managing this team when this person went out on maternity leave? And I start to talk. And I say things like, my expectations were that this was a high-performing team, that this would be a very small percentage of my time that was really going to be just holding things together while this person was away. And so I would continue to provide some support and check in with the team, but they are high performers. They know what their job is. They're working directly with clients and providing high quality services. And my expectation was that, that would be what I was continuing. And that is totally different from what happened, right? And so I've given a lot of information. There's a good indication that this is a relevant issue for her to explore further. And you'll notice that what she does next is not jump right into exploring that. She does some reflecting, which we talked about on day one, right? She reflects back some of the things that she's heard, so I make sure that I get that she's hearing me. But she's gonna ask more questions because she's still trying to just get a broad sense of what seems to be important. What are the important issues here? So she asks this question, right? So what's been the impact of this whole situation on you for the past year? And I start to share with her that, I'm working 7 days a week. I have no time to see my family. It's created a lot of tension and pressure for me within the team because I'm feeling so stretched. I feel like I'm not able to provide the quality of supervision that I want to, and I'm really, really struggling, right? Again, a lot of information. And so then she asks this question. She says, okay, so, how is this impacting your team? And I said, look, that's honestly not the big issue here. My team is still functioning, they're doing what they need to do, but I'm really struggling because I'm trying to ensure that they have what they need. And I still don't feel I'm providing it in a quality way. So what you'll notice here is these issues that come up in red, those are the areas of relevance. These other questions are good indications that these are not where my manager needs to spend a lot more of her time exploring things. Instead, what she needs to do is dig deeper into these areas. And all of that digging is designed to help her uncover what is really important to me, okay? What are my interests? What's motivating me to say that I'm gonna leave this job unless she resolves this? She needs to know what's going to motivate me in order to resolve this in a way that will keep me in the organization, okay? So after she's done this, relevant, what's irrelevant, really exploring kind of broadly what those things are. And she's identified a couple of areas. The next thing that she's going to do is move from identifying areas of relevance and irrelevance, which she's done, to then exploring each of those areas of relevance in more depth, using a technique we call funneling. So this technique, I'm going to illustrate, again, continuing this example that I've just introduced. So what she does is she takes this issue of expectations. She knows that my expectations for this job and the fact that there was a real difference between my expectations and what actually happened, she knows that that's relevant to this conversation. It's one of the things that's motivating me or potentially motivating me to say I'm gonna leave unless she resolves this. So she wants to understand that better. So what she does is she says, tell me more about your expectations. What were your expectations for this job, right? She's using that tell me more question that we talked about in our open-ended question segment. And so what I say is, I expected, as I said earlier, that this was a high-performing team. And in fact, that's not at all what's happened. There are really significant performance issues. And it's been really, really hard to deal with. And so she follows up. Give me some examples of the performance issues you're talking about, okay? She's still asking an open-ended question, but you'll notice that it's becoming more focused. She's digging deeper, getting narrower to really understand what is it that I'm trying to say. So I say to her, well, in terms of these performance issues, some of the things that I'm seeing are, poor client engagement on the part of some of the direct service providers. I'm seeing that people have really tense dynamics on a team, so there's very little trust amongst team members. I'm seeing that there are issues with people even showing up on time, so there's a range of performance issues, many of which are directly impacting our clients because these are client-facing positions. And so my manager, right, concerned by hearing this, says, again, a clarifying question, when you say poor client engagement, what do you mean? Tell me more about that. And so I say, I have observed and had to respond to members of this new team yelling at clients, denying them services, not letting them come into our center when we have 10 minutes before we close because they don't want to be held a couple minutes later and serve that client. So those are some specific examples. Okay? So again, helping the manager really understand what are the issues here, and her spending the time really giving me the opportunity to express this. So she asks this next question: how have you been dealing with this? And I say, look, the reality is I've had to invest a tremendous amount of my time managing this secondary team. So I've had to build processes to repair some of the trust that's broken down. I've had to meet individually with all of these team members to sit down and talk about where has trust broken down. What would they need to be able to repair the trust? What kind of commitment can they make to engaging in open conversations with their team members? What are my expectations of how they contribute as a supportive member of this team? So I've had to have these individual conversations. I've been building a team building process to get people to talk to each other openly. I've also had to put 2 people on performance improvement plans because of issues around timeliness and client engagement. This has become a huge investment on my part to really manage this team, okay? And then finally, after we've had this conversation, and there are many other questions that she has asked and a lot of reflecting that she's done throughout the course of this conversation, we get to the point where we're really ready to start to talk about solutions, right? What would I like to see happen? And at this point in the conversation, because I have had the opportunity to really vent, and I see that my manager is hearing me, right? She's asked all of these really connected, relevant questions. She's reflected back through the course of our conversation. She's used other techniques that we'll talk about to really demonstrate listening. By the time she asks me this question, I am in a different headspace and I am ready to be really much more open to the process of problem solving. So even though I came in at the beginning of this conversation saying, you need to solve this problem or I'm quitting, much later in this conversation, 20 minutes in, when she's asked this, I'm able to say things like, I really need us to look at hiring somebody or shifting responsibility immediately so that I can get some relief from working with this team. And that's different than me saying, I'm quitting tomorrow unless you resolve this. I'm starting to propose ways that we might even look at this and resolve this. And so what we're trying to do, again, as I said earlier, is to give you some skills so that you can uncover what's important to people, what's motivating people, what are their experiences, so that by the time you ask some of those problem-solving oriented questions, like what would you like to see happen, they are in a position to help you brainstorm ways to resolve this in a way that's going to meet their needs, and you can be sure to know what those needs are, okay? So that is an example of how we use these concepts of relevance and irrelevance and funneling as a way of asking questions to identify what's important to people and how do we really identify that to get to the problem-solving point in a conversation, okay? I want to show you a couple of other inquiry techniques that you can use, again, to help uncover interests. One technique is called Q prep, question prep. And essentially, this is something that many of you are probably doing regularly when you interview people or you set yourselves up to have exploratory conversations about other things. And Q prep is all about spending some time on your own, coming up with a list of questions that you could ask somebody to help uncover what's important to them. What are their needs? And these are the kinds of things that you would do if you were going to go into an interview and see whether somebody was a good fit for a job. you might spend some time before that interview writing down all of the relevant questions you want to ask them. That's exactly what Q-Prep is. It's spending that time before you respond to somebody or before you go into what could be a difficult conversation with an employee, thinking about the kinds of questions you would want to ask. So what I'm going to ask is that you take a moment using your participant guides and answer this question. Okay, read the scenario and jot down a list of all of the possible questions you could use if you were to approach an employee to address and have a problem-solving conversation with them about this. And just take about 5 minutes and then we'll report out. Great. So in addition to all of the examples that you've given of open-ended questions you could ask somebody, these are some additional questions, right? Tell me more. That's one of our best questions we can ask. How is this impacting you? Why is it important to you? And so on. Okay, these are questions that you can have in your back pocket. They're great questions to ask when helping people uncover what their interests are. You can also use techniques that have to do with time travel. So you can explore the past with people, and in a moment we'll talk about how you explore the future. But the idea here is that when you're helping people think about the problems that they have and think about what's important to them, one of the things that you can do is help people reflect back on past experiences, often that were either positive or negative, to help uncover what worked or what didn't work and how that informs what their present situation is. So for example, you might say to a staff member, you know, I understand that you're having trouble managing your time. Can you think about a time in the past where you've struggled with this and been able to resolve it? And what you're doing is helping take them out of this present moment where they may be feeling really frustrated and really stuck and thinking about the past and thinking, oh wow, I was able to overcome this challenge, and here's what I did and here's how I could apply it in the present. So essentially you're tapping into their base of knowledge and experience to help remind them what skills they have or what lessons they've learned to inform their current situation. You can also explore the future. And this is a way of asking people future-oriented questions like, what's your ideal vision for the future? Or what would you like things to look like in 6 months? And by doing that, you're helping people get out of that sort of stuck mindset that they might be in, where they're feeling like they couldn't possibly see a way out of resolving this problem in the present situation, by helping them think about the future. And then you can work backwards. So if you say to somebody, you know, tell me what you'd like this situation to look like in 6 months, and they say, well, you know, in 6 months, I'd like to have systems set up where I can clearly see what I'm doing for each day and how to prioritize different tasks that come to me. Great. So if you're looking for systems, what do we need to do in the next 6 months to help you build those systems, right? So you're asking a future-oriented question, and then you're returning to the present to help them work toward how they might achieve that future vision. Here are some examples of past-oriented and future-oriented questions, okay? And you'll just read through these with the group and give any other examples or relevant examples from your management experience of how you've used those. And then there's one more technique I want to remind you about before we start to practice this. So the technique is something we brought up yesterday, reflection. Do you remember yesterday when I talked about using reflection as a way to continue the conversation and invite people to keep talking? Essentially, reflection can often act as a question itself, even though you're not framing it as a question. So I encourage you, when you're helping people uncover what their interests are and problem solve and figure out what really are the issues here, use reflection, both to help demonstrate that you understand what's been said and to help people continue to talk so that they're able to really say what they need to say and you understand the scope of the problem, okay? And then you're going to put this slide up so that it's behind you and people can use it as a reference point when you do the next activity.